whether this field operates according to what was proposed by the strategies that function beyond supporting a disciplinary frame that occupies a control, or whether it was tactically, against or more fluidly against what can be the complicit and normative drive of the neoliberal discourse that plays down universities as sites of knowledge and government thought. So we titled it Roy's work. So it is now called The Perils of Institutionalization. So not the pearls, but the perils. Now, Roy was initially going to do the plenary. He was going to read some of his very important texts.
I should mention maybe just briefly,
Oh, right. Okay.
some of these images in the background have nothing to do with this talk. They're there for distraction purposes totally. So if you want to wander away from our discussion, then you have something to aim your imagination. All the desires you've left at home back on the screen. And these are collages from my book, Mannequin Rising. And these are collages I've worked on since I retired, so I just have them in the background, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of the creative work if we get some time.
Yes.
So anyway, so they're back there.
Yeah. And is that your risk that you allow yourself to meditate on these images?
Actually,
as
they're
well?
going way faster than I thought. It's actually not working. It's going too fast. I don't know if you can change it.
Want me to change?
Okay, anyway, we'll get back on track there. So as you can see already, we're moving quite tactically. Roy was gonna do this essays reading, but what we decided, I was brought on basically last week, and tactically the panel was rearranged, and we thought what we would do is more of a dialogic engagement, because we really want to, in talking to Roy, Roy was one of my teachers when I was an undergraduate. Actually, when I first started working in the Japanese Canadian community, Roy was there warning me at your peril. So,
enter the discourse at your peril.
yes.
But she didn't listen.
No. But that was before I was going to study anything Japanese Canadian. So we wanted to really underline how this term has been constituted through a number of different forces, and one of them is community-based activism. And really this term, Asian-Canadian, is a very interesting term because ontologically it's very unstable. I would argue it's inherently empty, since it only comes into being as an active act of agency at the intersection of possibilities. And these possibilities happen at sites of dynamic power. So it doesn't really even exist until you enact it. If you start filling it with terms and using it as a category, then it becomes disciplinary. So part of what we're wanting to do is interrogate the term and how it emerged. This is going to be an open-ended discussion, so we'll say things that might sound, you might disagree with, that's good. We're not trying to make anyone feel safe or comfortable, we're trying to be kind of provocative. So feel free to disagree with us and shout, no, you're wrong.
No, you're wrong.
Oh, there you go. there, this is exactly. We're leaving. But yeah, so we want that type of dialogue. And there's a lot of people, as Larissa has pointed out, who've been in collaboration with Roy as Ashok has. There's a lot of people here who will have different things to say and have very different positions than necessarily
A lot of unknown subjects in the room.
That's a good
So,
thing.
we want to start this off because this is your workshop, and you've got to, when you move into a field of knowledge, if you move into it as if it's a disciplinary normative space, what you're going to be doing is a waste of time because there's not going to be anything for you to do except repeat what's already written, repeat the rules, things according to the rules that have been written. So what's exciting about this field is its political and creative possibilities and what can be done, and that means disturbance. So we are going to start now, and I'm going to turn to Roy, and sort of chatty mode. And this is Roy, so.
Yes, I'm
There we
here.
go. So,
I'm a compliance subject.
yes. So I grew up on Vancouver Island, basically in the late 60s and the 70s. And when I was a child growing up, there wasn't any language or name to really to inhabit. There was no subject position I could inhabit in the province racialized language. As a child and as a teenager, I remember there being a lot of this underlying disturbance that would emerge sometimes as hate, as desire, as fear, and then certain subjects, certain bodies would be targeted as abject. But I do remember in the 70s my mother buying these books by Kenadachi, by Takahashi. So there was, at a certain point in my life when I grew up, at least books and literature that began to show me that there was a language, there was a collective writing about another way to be in this province. So when I think about your work, when I think of the time when you began to do work, I think of the space of erasure, and then how you emerged from it. So I wondered if you could talk more about that.
Okay, first off, thanks for the introduction. It was great to situate Asian Canadian within a more of an intellectual, academic, theoretical context. And I agree with Kirsten that Asian Canadian as a term is highly flexible and is not necessary. In other words, it's not something that we have as a state of being. It's something we choose to follow. And it has no necessary existence. It could die tomorrow, and what would happen to the world? Well, probably the world would keep going, right? It wouldn't be as if all traffic would stop and all culture would cease because somebody says, there's no more Asian Canadian culture. Somebody says, well, Asian Canadian culture, maybe we should, as Asian Canadians, decide we're taking our culture back. We're not going to allow Canadians to have it anymore. And see what would happen if it weren't there anymore? There would be a lot of things would be missing from Canadian life. In fact, Canadian culture would suffer a trauma because of the absence of Asian Canadian. But at the same time, when Asian Canadian functions within this context, often it doesn't get visible. It doesn't get the attention it really deserves. So it's kind of strange for me because Asian as a term comes out of a pretty dark history of racialization. And it wasn't really great to be an Asian before 1960, before the late 60s, up until the time when multiculturalism starts to function, up until that point at which immigration changed in 67 to 69, when there's a lot of Asian immigration. The demographics were quite different before that time, and it wasn't really good to be Asian. It was in fact bad to be Asian. And then in the early 70s, it was suddenly good to be Asian. And now today, it's super good to be Asian, right? So some of my students wish they were Asian, because they want to actually take on Asian culture, because it's more interesting than Western culture. Its food is better, its design sense is better, its clothing way better. And traveling in Asia is far more interesting. Well, there's a lot of these things, so it's good, actually, a good thing to be Asian now. And maybe Asian Canadian studies is good right now because of the value given to Asian things. I'm going to read, for me, biographically, I started a lot of my early work in thinking about Asian Canadian studies, and then at this critical turn around the late 60s, early 70s. And I went to retirement in 1969, thinking that since I was in Canada, I always considered Japanese, I could go to Japan and find out what constitutes my Japaneseness, if there's such a thing. So I could go live there, and maybe I could stay there. So I thought